we saw were, first of all, hoop skirts and bobby socks were in, like the 50s. But the 60s was about showing skin. And so what we saw were designers who were saying, guess what? We're going to acknowledge the fact that these women are not going to just be appropriately attired. They are doing this avant-garde anti-cultural movement. And so they started selling mini skirts.
Hello, and welcome to Not Born Yesterday, a podcast dedicated to older adults and the challenges and joys of aging. I'm Miriam Goodman. Not Born Yesterday examines the problems and solutions of growing older today. We bring you the wisdom and voices of experts in the field of aging and offer tips on how to feel your best, use your lifetime skills and experience, and make the coming months and years as fulfilling as possible.
I'm Lynn Winter Gross. Not Born Yesterday is brought to you by Next Village SF, a local nonprofit providing older adults with support to help age in place.
Today on Not Born Yesterday, we're continuing our walk down memory lane and examining the culture of our listeners. After the great reception to our episode on music, now we're looking at what we wore and why, the fashions of the boomers. While not all young girls wore crinolines or saddle shoes, or young males let their sideburns grow, we have all been influenced by and are part of the fashion trends of our lives.
Our guest today is Shawn Grain Carter, professor of fashion business management at the Fashion Institute of Technology, part of the State University of New York. She's also a former buyer at luxury fashion stores. Shawn, welcome to Not Born Yesterday.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Shawn, before we get into the history of what we wore, can you tell us how fashion has influenced culture and what it tells us about the times?
Yes. First of all, I'm glad you asked that question because fashion is not in a vacuum. It is based on culture, politics, art, and people. And so when we look at fashion, it's actually a reflection of the times, and particularly when we talk about the 60s and rock and roll and rhythm and blues and their influence on fashion during that era, we see direct connections between how people dress and how they were living their lives.
So when did we change from making clothes at home to being able to buy them in our stores?
That change occurred at the beginning of the 20th century in America when, in the military, it was required that menswear have clothing mass produced for the war effort. That was when sizing was first introduced en masse in the United States. Subsequently, after the war, we saw women who initially were working in the war effort to help produce some of these uniforms in different factories. They decided that that could be something that could be introduced to the masses to democratize fashion at a more affordable price point. So we started to see that although people were still making clothes at home or using seamstresses, we started to also see the dressmakers have the opportunity to work with direct manufacturers and start mass producing women's wear as well as men's wear in terms of sizing and creating that opportunity for styles to be worn for the masses.
Well, since some of our listeners probably were born in the 40s, let's begin there. I assume that all these uniforms you're talking about led to fabric shortages because people were using so many of the things for uniforms. So what did the clothes look like? Did they have trimming? Did they have very simple lines with no frills on the outside? And was fabric actually rationed the way food was during the war so that people had to do with what they could get?
Well, I think you're referencing World War One and Two. So during those two particular wars, yes, we did have rationing. Specifically, for example, the man-made fabric nylon, because it was used for parachutes and things like that. So nylon was rationed, and that was when women were starting to use nylon as opposed to silk for their stockings, which we now call hosiery. Uh, there were other fabrics that were rationed, however, not as much, believe it or not, as nylon.
When did women stop wearing corsets and I guess change over to girdles?
Well, we can thank Paul Poiret, the couturier, who thankfully got rid of the corset. And that was around 19, I want to say 10, 1913. These kinds of opportunities were a democratization of how we saw the feminine body. So it didn't have to be constricted, if you will. So what we saw was a shift in the silhouette, and that shift was also representative of the burgeoning suffrage movement for the right to vote. So women were being empowered to not just exert their freedom in terms of forms of dress, but to assert their freedom in terms of the space socially and politically. And so fashion mirrors that, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well.
When I tell people I'm talking to somebody about fashion and how fashion has changed, and the first thing people talk about is, oh my God, those girdles and nylons that we had to wear all through high school and college. And
Well,
having the clear fingernail polish to fix the runs in our stockings.
I still, believe it or not, keep clear fingernail polish in my purse and in my office in case of a run because I learned it from my mother, who learned it from her grandmother and then the great grandmother. So these little tricks of the trade are, opportunities for us to not only reminisce, but be pragmatic. And that's the thing about fashion. Today, though, you have a culture of instead of mending or fixing, it's just consumerism on steroids. But getting back to, the nylons, yes, we saw that shift started to occur. And again, it's reflecting the type of music, the type of dance, the type of leisure activities women are starting to participate in. So we see more women bicycling, which required pedal pushers. That was kind of pant that you could wear so it wouldn't get caught in the chain of the bicycle. So fashion is reflecting the different aspects of a woman's life in terms of her role in society, not just as a mother or a wife, but women are entering the workforce and they are working. And we saw that starting to happen with the flappers in the 20s. They are earning their own money. They are going out dancing. They are wearing short haircuts, which was considered revolutionary, the bob look. We don't see that shift again until the 1960s. And that's when we see the counterculture movement, which Diana Vreeland, the Vogue editor, called youthquake. Again, this is an assertion of not just women, but it's the first time you have young people, particularly influencing fashion, as opposed to couturiers and designers. So that was a marked shift in terms of fashion being influenced directly, trickling down, up, as opposed to up, down. Traditionally, fashion always started with the monarchy, then the nobility, then the upper classes, and then it would trickle down to the lower classes. What you see in the 60s is the complete opposite. It is the first time fashion is dictated by the youth, and not just in the United States, but elsewhere throughout the world.
So just to back up a little bit to the beginning of the 60s, what about the influence that Jackie Kennedy had on the fashions of adult women?
I'm so glad you asked that because the first thing that we see, and I'm going to talk about Jacqueline as well as her husband for a second. When John F. Kennedy was elected, it's the first time men stopped wearing a fedora hat. He is the first president to not wear a hat at the inauguration. However, Jacqueline wore her pillbox hat and she wore her appropriate suit. So, white gloves, pearls, all of that was still proper attire for a proper upper class lady. That shift starts to change really as you start to go into 1964, 1965, the turbulence in terms of politics the protests with Vietnam, the assassination of Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. All of this turbulence starts to influence fashion, and it becomes anti-fashion because it's reflecting the anti-establishment, counterculture, anti-Vietnam War. All of this is a countercultural movement that's reflected in fashion. So from the beginning of the 60s, it's ladylike dressing, and then we go into the mid 60s and the late 60s, and it is a complete upheaval in terms of what we consider fashion norms. So you have the beatniks, and these are writers who are wearing dark sunglasses and black turtlenecks, and they are very anti-establishment. You see the Black Panthers with the beret. They borrowed the beret from the French who stormed the Bastille for their independence. You see women dressing in mini skirts and high thigh boots. And you see also, though, the return of preppy on college campuses. So you have a lot of conflicts happening at the same time in terms of fashion. You've got Mary Quant in England mirroring the counterculture look with Twiggy, the model. And they're wearing, these beautiful Courrèges space dresses and, shifts and the A-line, but they're short and they're sexy and they're bold. Um, and so all of this is happening simultaneously. And it's a reflection of, the first time Paris, London, and Milan are not dictating fashion. What's happening is the young people are dictating fashion, and they are gravitating towards those designers that understand that they are not going to dress like their parents. They are not going to dress in terms of what is acceptable, norms, standards for how a lady should look. All of these kids are black and white and all over the country listening to the same music. And here you have music and art and dance allowing young people to not only dictate fashion, but to change the cultural zeitgeist in terms of how they're socializing. And you don't see that shift change again until social media. So, fashion is a reflection of what's happening at that point in time, and it mirrors all the influences of, politics, economics, social class, and all the reflections therein.
I wanted to move back a little bit when you talk about how the young people were influencing fashion. And do you mean that a woman would take her skirt and shorten it herself, and then designers would see that people were doing that? I mean, how did it go up from the bottom to the top?
Well, it's not so much that people were shortening their own skirts. What we saw were, first of all, hoop skirts and bobby socks were in, like the 50s. But the 60s was about showing skin. And so what we saw were designers who were saying, guess what? We're going to acknowledge the fact that these women are not going to just be appropriately attired. They are doing this avant-garde anti-cultural movement. And so they started selling mini skirts. I think of designers like Mary Quant, who I'd mentioned before, but there were other designers doing it. And then you also have the introduction of women wearing menswear looks. Yves Saint Laurent did La Smoking Jacket. He introduced the first tuxedo pantsuit for women of the upper classes to wear. You still had women wearing, mini dresses and mini skirts, but that was another shift that women are proclaiming their power by being anti-establishment in one way and also saying we're proclaiming our own sexuality. So they're going to wear a mini dress because they feel like it, not necessarily dressing for the male gaze, if you will. And so this is all happening at the same time. I say it's looking at sweetness of the 50s and the 40s, giving away to the sassiness and the sexiness of the 60s. And what we're seeing is women deciding, yet again, we're going to determine what's acceptable and on our terms, not someone else's.
if a designer had come up with the mini skirts, Mary Quant, and the girls weren't buying them, then what would have happened? I mean, they would have gone back to something longer. How does that whole cycle begin?
Well, the cycle begins with, in the United States anyway, with looking at Paris, London, and Milan. And so Paris, London, and Milan, traditionally for the past 100 years in terms of 20th century fashion, have dictated what happens in the United States. With the emergence of the United States having their own designers, that changed because we took sportswear to a new level, because we wanted to dress more practically. And so sportswear became something that was uniquely American, hence taking denim, which was traditionally used for agrarian culture on a farm, and we make designer jeans out of it in the 1970s because Calvin Klein thinks that that look is sexy and cool on, a young ingenue model. And it's also the first time en masse women are allowed to wear pants in the United States of America. Up until the 70s, it was inappropriate for a woman to wear pants. In the 70s, you see women starting to wear pantsuits and they're starting to wear pants. I remember in public schools, you girls were not allowed to wear pants.
And
So
nor were teachers.
that's right. Teachers, girls, women, you just were not allowed. So you had the power suits, which were skirt suits, and you had the power suits, which were pantsuits.
What about Princess Diana and the influence that she had on fashion? She wore what she wore, whatever she had so beautifully. What do you think her legacy was in terms of fashion?
I think that Princess Diana's legacy in terms of fashion was initially the dutiful wife of an important monarch. And then it transitioned into an independent monarch and a global princess, not just the princess for the United Kingdom, but the princess for the world, because she was seen holding a baby during the height of the AIDS epidemic. And that was a game changer in terms of how she was perceived by not just the public in the United Kingdom, but the entire world. And the second change was when you saw her dancing at the White House in that beautiful blue velvet gown with John Travolta. When you saw them on the dance floor, it harkened back to the disco era when John Travolta became a household name. Princess Diana's legacy is she was the people's princess, and her fashion reflected the class and grace that people expected from a princess who understood the masses and also empathized with them, although she was still of royal lineage and nobility.
So I remember the first time I got an invitation to a party and it said dress is business casual. And I didn't know what that meant at the time, but how did that all come about? We're talking about hippies and ponchos and disco and classic everything else, and all of a sudden there's something called business casual.
Oh, that I remember so well. And to this day, we still have inquiries from various human resource departments about what is appropriate attire for business casual. Okay, so business casual began actually for the convenience of New York City employees in industries like advertising, banking, and other areas where they wanted to be able to leave on Friday to go to the Hamptons and change from their uptight classic attire to something more comfortable to start the weekend. And so companies started allowing them to bring a change of clothes, to change out of their very structured attire to something more casual. Then we move into the minimalist 90s, and you have the tech bros on the West Coast dressing casually all the time. And my point is, they were always wearing jeans and a turtleneck or a crisp white shirt and jeans. And so they were casual all the time. And they decided to not just do it in the summer, but to do it all year long. And so the tech industry, West Coast influence of corporate casual started to seep into the East Coast, particularly in your creative industries like publishing or advertising or the entertainment music industry. Human resource departments started saying, oh, we offer business casual. And that became a perk to attract people in positions of power, whether they were vice presidents or CEOs, to say, come and work with us because we don't have this stodgy attire requirement as a dress code.
What do you think about poor fashion choices?
Well, I have to tell you, I used to tell my daughter, I don't care if it's in fashion or in style, it's inappropriate. And that was a word she detested hearing from my lips. And I'll never forget, she challenged me by saying, well, you know what? You're in the fashion business and you're selling inappropriate attire. And I said, yes, because it's a business, and if they can profit from inappropriate attire, they will. But you, as the consumer, have the power to vote with your pocketbook. And therefore, you should vote against something that hypersexualizes you when you are a woman with her own agency to make decisions for herself.
How much about fashion do you think is influenced by where clothes are made?
I think it's particularly important to Generation Z and millennials. They are driving this sustainability and circularity movement in terms of not just where the product is made, but they are looking at, is this a factory that employs children? And they're also looking at, is this sourced responsibly in terms of the factory dispersing the dyes and not polluting the rivers? Is this sourced responsibly in terms of how you are taking care of the planet as well as the community in which you operate? So many consumers are starting to say they want to know how this product was made from concept to consumer and how it went through the supply chain to ensure that they are purchasing an item that reflects their values. But the irony is this: we're in a very high inflationary environment, particularly in the United States. And, there's talk about stagflation. If you're shopping at Walmart and you're shopping at other discounters, you are probably purchasing fabrics and merchandise from factories that don't share your core values. You can't possibly think that you're buying an item that's a dress for 20 or $30 and that they're paid a living wage even in their own country where that product was manufactured. So I think that consumers have to be educated, but they also have to be honest about what is it that they're willing to pay to have an item that's made either in a union shop in the United States or in a factory in China that you can be assured is paying people a fair living wage.
So we've walked through the fashions of the times and the politics that are involved with it. But one thing I have to say that I kind of miss is when I travel abroad, everybody looks the same. It doesn't matter what country you're in, they're wearing jeans, they're wearing sneakers, whatever it is. And then, of course, there's a Gap and another American store right on the corner. So what happened to the sense of looking Italian or looking French or being able to see someone and seeing, they're reflecting their own particular culture? It just seems to me we're all wearing everything the same.
Oh, well, you can thank social media for that. I say the exact same thing. I tease my students because I say, you're supposed to be trendsetters. You're supposed to be early adopters of fashion, and all of you are wearing jeans. You're paying top dollar to have someone rip up your jeans, which I think is a crime. However, I understand that peer pressure is very influential. And so social media has democratized fashion throughout the world. I think it's those who are more daring who are going to say, I'm going to go against the trend. And that's hard to do because they all want to be in community with the brand and they all want to be on TikTok or Instagram. If you would just get off some of these platforms, you could dress a little more like an individual. Let's be in community in real life. And let's dress the way we feel like it. Let's dress according to our mood. That's what real empowerment is. You don't dress like everybody else. You dress the way you want to dress because you can.
Well, Shawn, thank you so much for helping us examine the fashions of our times. Our guest was Shawn Grain Carter of the Fashion Institute of Technology.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Today on News You Can Use, we want to tell you about a new report by the former United States Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy. The Surgeon General is the person responsible for the nation's trust in science and health, and his report may come as a shock. According to the research, drinking alcohol will raise your risk of cancer, but most people don't even know that. Did you know that alcohol consumption is the third leading preventable cause of cancer in the United States, just behind tobacco and obesity? And the risks of getting cancer from drinking even one drink a day only increase as we age.
You probably remember that recent studies suggest that 1 or 2 glasses of red wine a day might benefit heart health, but other studies indicate that more research is required. Some experts say no amount of alcohol is safe for cancer prevention. In fact, the risks are so great that both the former Surgeon General and a cancer specialist suggest there should be warning labels on alcohol indicating it causes cancer. Another report highlights specific risks of alcoholic consumption for seniors. Older adults may be less aware of these effects, even as they are experiencing them. In addition to the increased risk of cancer, too much alcohol can lead to falls, osteoporosis, memory loss, liver disease, and early mortality.
Although we may have enjoyed a limited amount of alcohol on a regular basis for years without any apparent problems, the effects of alcohol are more pronounced and come on more quickly as we get older. As we age, we're more sensitive to the effects of alcohol on balance, coordination, attention, and driving skills. In addition, due to changes in the body like reduced muscle mass, some of us may reach higher blood alcohol concentrations than younger people, even if we consume the same amount of alcohol.
Still, some alcohol can remain a part of a healthy lifestyle. Enjoying a drink with friends or family may contribute to maintaining social connections and a sense of enjoyment. Just reduce the frequency and the portions of your drinks. These warnings may be worrisome, but there's some good news. In this time of creative entrepreneurs, alcohol-free bars have recently opened around the country. Mocktails and non-alcoholic wine and beer are available, and customers still have a place to hang out with their friends and stay sober. The evidence is strong. The less you drink, the lower your cancer risk. In other words, think before you drink. And that's our podcast for today. Our thanks to our guest, Shawn Carter of the Fashion Institute of Technology. You can learn more about Next Village SF at their website, nextvillagesf.org. Our theme music is from Hook Sounds, and Jason Dahlstedt is our engineer. And we thank you for listening. We'd love to hear what you would like us to discover and discuss. Please contact us at notbornyesterdaypodcast.org. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. All of these are free and let us know our audience better. Be well, stay strong, and remember, you weren't born yesterday. I'm Lynn Winter Gross.
And I'm Miriam Goodman.